Actually, the title of that paper it's sort of the written paper that's in your conference documents. And for my presentation, I thought I'd like to be a little bit more specific and talk about how I've sampled the Katakoloq corpus to address specific hypotheses. So it's more like a linguistic perspective on corpus construction. So just a little bit regarding my background. So for the past 6 years, I've been visiting Desa-Kolok, deaf village, literally in Balinese, and visiting them for longer and shorter periods, and that accumulated to 13 months within the community. And I've been working on Katakoloq, which is literally the language of the deaf in Balinese. And during the times that I spent in the community, I've been involved in the initiation of inclusive deaf education within the village's elementary school. And that has been running now for 5 years. And actually, last week, another deaf student entered the school. She's a 6-year-old, so she's quite young. And I've also been sort of dedicated to document Katakoloq adequately, I would say, which is an ongoing process, and to ensure that the language is kept for future generations of linguists, but also for the community itself, as Katakoloq might become endangered. And the current corpus of Katakoloq includes 120 hours of video data that have been archived by both the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen, but also by the Islands Institute and in Preston, UK. And I think Ulrike Zaschan will talk a little bit more about islands later on. So my aim for this presentation, as I just said, I would like to sort of demonstrate the importance of corpus analysis as a tool for documenting and describing sign languages, and also how we can sample our corpora to capture the specific social situation of sign language communities. And I'll be focusing on rural signing varieties such as Katakoloq. And I also show a little bit of how this sort of targeted data collection can be used to test specific hypotheses regarding the differences between urban and signing varieties. So I do realize it's a little bit abstract, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to walk you through it. So first I'll tell you a little bit more about the village, about sort of the patterns of language acquisition and the setup within the community of deaf people. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the special typological features, the linguistic features of Katakoloq's grammar, and I'll be focusing on person reference. And I'll show some preliminary evidence for a context dependency hypothesis. So where it seems that the fact that the language is usually used within a situation where there's a lot of common ground among signers has impacted on the language. And I'll be telling more about this later on. So before I go into any details, these are just a few pictures that I've collected over the years to show you that Katakoloq is a very typical Balinese village in most respects. So people are farmers, they're Hindu, and well, I'll show you some pictures. There's no visuals today. No, I'm just kidding. There's no pictures. Somehow this slide was full of nice pictures of deaf dance and, you know, these Balinese kerbau, the special cows that they use in the rice gardens, and a Hindu procession of people wearing a sarong, very colorful. But it's not coming up at the moment, so I hope I'll have better luck with my videos. Anyway. Oh, now it is. Ah, there you go. This is one of the deaf kids. These are Balinese cockfights. So just to give you an impression, really. So really the only factor that makes Desa-Kolok different from other villages within the area, that there's 2.2% of congenital deafness within the community. And this is caused by a recessive gene, which causes shortened hair cells within the cochlea. And this gene is also carried by 70% of the hearing population. So it's quite widespread within the community, and that implicates that deafness has been there for a considerable amount of time. A conservative estimate of the number of generations of native signers is over 5 generations, and that's counting from the first substantial cohort of deaf people within the community. And at present, there's 46 deaf signers of all age groups, so, well, going from about 6 years till very old. And, but there's also 1,200 hearing people who sign with varying degrees of proficiency. And that's about 54% of the community. And these are just hearing people who use sign language in day-to-day interaction with their deaf neighbors, colleagues, relatives, and friends. I think it's important to point out that Katukalok is currently used as a language of instruction within the inclusive deaf unit within the village elementary school, and also that this is one of the very few cases of a village sign language being adopted in such a setting, and we don't know yet what sort of implications that might have for the development of the language. Katukalok has also been observed during Hindu ceremonies where there's a Hindu priest who becomes possessed by one of the deaf ancestors. And it's also used by deaf and hearing women when they prepare Hindu offerings for these ceremonies. It's used in more professional domains, such as when the hearing village nurse tends to deaf villagers, or when deaf and hearing men fix the water pipe system, which is very important for farmers within the community, and also when they bargain over things like rice or cattle, for instance. But I guess mostly Katukalok is used in social context, so when the types of settings that I already mentioned, like preparing communal meals in preparation of these Hindu ceremonies, but also when deaf and hearing people have a cup of coffee in one of the kiosks in the village, or in one of the many family compounds, so shared houses with deaf and hearing family members within the community. And this type of setting is quite different from urban signing communities, and it has important implications for the constitution of the types of signers you find within the community. So first of all, deaf signers are actually only a small minority of the community, and they only constitute 4% of the total number of Katukalok signers. And this is very striking from the perspective of urban sign languages, where it's mostly close relatives of deaf people or professionals, such as interpreters or teachers of the deaf, who learn to sign as a second language. And there's virtually no hearing people who learn to sign. We actually don't have specific numbers on urban signing communities, as far as I'm aware of, but it would appear that this is quite a striking difference. So. And I should also note, however, that although there's lots of hearing signers, they have varying degrees of fluency. And in fact, more than half of the signing community is a non-fluent sign language user. So although there's a readiness and a very positive attitude towards deafness and sign language use within the community, so that they're not all as fluent. But there's also a number of native signers, so there's 10% of native signers, but most of these are also actually hearing people. So and these are sometimes hearing grandchildren of deaf people, but they live in larger compounds, so they're not necessarily identified as codas, but they're kind of, so this group of native hearing signers is a little bit more extensive, it would seem. So, when hearing individuals acquire sign language in most countries, it's inevitably later in life, because it's mostly for professional reasons. And so there are very few hearing signers of urban sign languages who learn to sign as children and become balanced bimodal bilinguals in at least one sign language and then one spoken language. And in the case of Katakalok, this is far more common, and this diagram shows that. I'm not sure whether I really have a lot of time to go into this, but this is a map of the village. And basically what it shows is the distribution of deaf people geographically throughout the village. And you can see that they're really well spread also across the different traditional family groups, the clans within the community. And this is very small, right? So it's less than 1 square kilometer all over. I wanted to go into endangerment of Katakalok a little bit further, but I think for now I'll just keep it a little bit simple. So quite similarly to the situation that Joke Schuit described of Inuit Sign Language, there's a lot increased contact with larger urban sign language within Indonesia. And these are Indonesian signing varieties used in other parts of Bali and also in other parts of Java, and even there might even be some Australian influence as well, because there's one deaf man from the village who has lived in Australia for at least 10 years and comes back regularly. And there's also some changing marital patterns. So people tend to find spouses from outside the village more frequently, and because these people don't carry the same recessive gene, the frequency of the gene causing deafness is reduced within the population. If anyone has more questions, I'd be happy to answer them over discussion time. So anyway, because of this changing situation, it's important to document this language while it's sort of still flourishing, I would say. And I've done this following Himmelman's documentary approach to linguistics. And his method entails capturing all the different contexts in which a sign language or language might be used. And in this case of the Katakalok corpus, I've started with really informal conversations of people signing in various participant configurations. So just one person or two people, or like bigger groups of people. And these types of data really resulted into culturally entrenched narratives. So stories about Hindu ceremonies that are upcoming, or about the cockfights you saw in the picture, but also about local politics, and also about a local deaf ghost who lives in the village cemetery. And so during the times that I spent in the community, I've also watched several deaf children grow up within deaf families. And so I've been very opportunistic and also collected longitudinal child signing data. And my research assistant, Ketut Kanta, deserves special mention in this case, because he's been really instrumental in helping collect this data bi-weekly. So anyway, I think this first language acquisition in a deaf village is particularly interesting, because these children they acquire sign language from birth, but not just from one or two deaf parents, but from a multitude of adult role models who are themselves native signers as well. And they do so in various contexts. So I've got recordings of deaf kids also going to a kiosk and buying some candy, and they can use sign language from a very early age within these contexts. So I'll be interested to see some of the first results in that matter. And also I've used sort of the more standard types of data elicitation that are used by many sign language linguists. So, and these involve like Canary Row. I don't know whether you know these videos, but they're like with the Tweety bird and the cat following it. And I've got things like with the mouse, with a sort of cartoon-type illustration materials mostly. And then also more similar things, like the types of materials Yoke discussed. And I've had sort of varying success with these types of materials. So sometimes, like Canary Row, people loved it, and they competed like who could do the best, role play and impression of the characters in the story. And then other things like eliciting color signs, it was a bit tricky because people said, well, I don't know, you learned this in school, So they felt very hesitant to do these kinds of things. And we, as a field work, we just have to be sensitive to them and be flexible and try different approaches, I think, in getting the best kinds of selection of data. I've also specifically, unlike other corpora, this corpus also has targeted sort of peripheral domains of sign language use. So what I mean is not the core deaf native signers that we're used to sort of analyzing, but also explicitly I've included hearing signers, also some of them that are non-fluent. And there's basically two reasons for them. One is an ethical consideration, so these hearing signers, as well as their deaf relatives, they feel like, you're also a signer, you're with us, we're the same. So they really feel like they own the language in a way as well. So that's one aspect, and I didn't want to exclude them for this reason. But also, I think it's really important because they're like 96% of the community. So whatever we find regarding the grammatical structure of Katakalok, they may be a really important element in sort of the development of the language so far. And another sort of unusual thing that I've included is sign bilinguals. So people who use Katakalok, but also are fluent in Indonesian Sign Language. So they're basically bilingual, and we don't really know what this kind of situation may result in, as it were. So that's also data that's not been transcribed yet. So I've talked a little bit about, this vast portion of hearing signers, and I think we might expect that this sort of cross-modal context situation would result in a larger degree of overlap between the structures of the signed language and the spoken language. And here I just, to illustrate, I don't have time to sort of go into detail of all the differences between the languages, but this is just a table to show you the differences in constituent orders, word orders, between the two languages. And as you can see, there are quite a few differences. So in Katakalok, modifiers, adjectives, let's say, can either precede or follow the noun, but the modifier noun order is most common. So that would be red car, or would be most common. And this is indicated by bold in the table. And then similarly, numerals can be placed in different positions, and they can also be incorporated within the noun. But then normally the noun is most frequently attested following the noun. So we get car 3, to say 3 cars. And this latter order is grammatical within spoken Balinese. And then with regard to negation, there's a reverse pattern between Katakalok and Balinese. And then with regards to word order, it's interesting to see that in both languages there's a lot of topic drop. So it's very rare to find a sentence with 2 overtly expressed arguments within one sentence. And then, so when you do find this, there's an equal distribution of SVO, SOV, and OVS word orders within Katakalok. And SOV word order is ungrammatical in Balinese. And the other word orders are also attested, but there's a strong preference for SVO word order in Balinese. So you can see, this is just one example, but there's really, it seems that these languages function independently of one another, which is a quite interesting phenomenon, I think. So based on these differences between Katakalok and Balinese, and also between Katakolok and other varieties of Indonesian Sign Language within the direct vicinity, I think we have to conclude that it's really a sign language isolate that has emerged within this community indigenously and has had limited, well, contact so far, at least for the majority of signers. And that might be changing for the younger generations. And I think that in that sense, Katakolok uniquely contributes to sign language typology and could really add to our understanding of the cross-linguistic diversity between sign languages. And so for this, so far my interest has been on the uses of signing space. And for the aims of this presentation, I'll just have to focus on third-person reference. But I'd be happy to talk about it more elaborately with people in person. So for people to really understand or to appreciate the valuable contribution that Katakolok makes, I'd like to just briefly get us all on the same page with regard to person reference in sign languages. So this is Sign Linguistics 101, so I apologize for those who know this already. But across a wide selection of sign languages, the use of anaphoric pointing in the neutral signing space has been shown to exist. So what I mean by this is basically that we point to areas in the signing space to create so-called loci, locations, that get a referential meaning within the discourse. So we need both the grammar and the discourse to resolve them. And subsequently, these sort of loci, they attain the sort of the status of a third-person pronoun. So they can be used to refer to objects and ideas, and also, of course, non-conversational partners. So a third-person reference. And as we all know, first and second person, so me and you, are indicated by pointing at the signer's own body versus that one of the interlocutor. And I think, as far as I know, Japanese Sign Language is the only sign language that points to the nose rather than the chest. I found this very interesting. First time when I met a deaf person, I thought this was his sign name. Yeah, but it turned out the first person pronoun. Anyway, in Katakolok, first person reference is marked out by signers by using the B hand rather than the index finger. So it's important to notice that loci are really crucial to the discourse coherence of sign languages, and they can also be used to locate certain nouns or even whole sentences to associate them with a particular reference. And this figure presents a mini discourse from Indian Sign Language. And in this example, the signer localizes two groups, deaf people and interpreters. One on the right side and one on the left side. And this is achieved not only by pointing, but also by articulating the sign group to the right and the left-hand side respectively. And then following, he discusses how there's 3 programs of teaching three teaching programs of three levels each for each group. So he does that by placing the numeral in these locations. And then also these loci are used on the level of morphosyntax. So when they are marked to show agreement between subject and object of transitive verbs. And this is shown by an example from Jordanian Sign Language. And the verb to tell can be directed from the first person to that of the addressee to mean I tell you, and then it can be directed in the other way to express you tell me. And in fact, many of these verbs are used in the lateral line of signing space to indicate third person to third person. Okay, so that's enough about other sign languages in a very general sense. I hope no one feels offended. But basically, until quite recently, many sign language researchers have, in fact, assumed that sign languages look very much alike in their use of the signing space. And this is particularly true for spatial verb inflection, which has been claimed to be a universal feature of sign language grammars. Or it had been anyway. And so for Asiyat Bedouin sign language used in Israel, as well as Katakolok are the only attested sign languages that lack this feature. And furthermore, the sets of transitive verbs that may be marked in this particular way are really restricted in Inuit sign language and Adabarobe sign language. Now, these 4 sign languages are all used in rural signing communities rather than urban signing communities. And this just begs the question whether there's some shared aspect of their social linguistic settings that sort of may explain these just differences between urban and rural signing varieties. And I think that it's also important, however, it's really important to use corpus analysis to establish the basic facts about sign languages. And this is, excuse me, I need to. Yeah, I think I just had to look at my notes for a minute. But corpus analysis is still far from common, and this field is, of course, pioneered by people like Trevor Johnston and Adam Shambry, and we're really happy to have them here. And I think one of the initial publications that came out is on transitive verbs within the Ausland corpus, so the corpus of Australian Sign Language, where it is shown that actually in spontaneous discourse, 30 to 35% of these verbs, of instances of use of transitive verbs, the spatial verb inflection is lacking. And I think this is really important to consider when we think about the differences between sign languages, because it suggests that maybe the differences between urban and rural signing varieties might disappear when we start to look at spontaneous discourse. So it raises the possibility that perhaps Katakolok does use spatial verb inflection, and we'll have to really use comparable data sets to establish whether this is the case or not. And this, I think this argument is thanks to the description of sign languages more generally, but I'm focusing here on the uses of signing space. So what I did is I looked at 1 hour and 19 minutes of densely coded data, and this is a subset of the total annotated Katakolok corpus. From 4 dialogues and 2 monologues, I've used data from deaf native signers only to make it optimally comparable to the research that's out there at the moment. So going back to this issue of localization, out of 1,092 pointing signs, I didn't find any instances of third-person references being used within the neutral signing space. And I want to add to that this might be a limited set because pointing is really common in sign languages. But I've also spent over a year in the community, and it's like a really, if you'd notice if something was happening, if you were really looking for it, right? So it's extremely unlikely that it really exists within Katakolok. So what do people do? They use pointing signs that are directed at geographical locations. So usually they point at a person's home base to indicate that person, apart from using sign names, of course. And these absolute pointing signs are essentially deictic, as they require extra linguistic information to be resolved. And in addition, when there's multiple references associated with one location, or when this location of a reference is unknown, people can also use a more abstract form of list boys. And this is a term coined by Scott Liddell for American Sign Language. And basically what people do, they point to the fingertips on the hand and project reference on there. And I've got a video of Katakaloq to show you where this is used in a narration about a signer's family history. And I'll first show you a loose translation of the video. I'll also read it out. So the first child was me, and at the time I was born, my parents were inexperienced at child rearing. The second one, Samyong, went well, and 2 months passed, and they took care of the baby well. The second child grew. The third, Budaya, died. The fourth, a girl, died. The fifth, the Sukrada, he would not accept breast milk. And she never explicitly mentions her parents, but they're the topic of the video, really, of the story. You'll notice the signers being a little bit articulate, and I think it's because I know all this, and I asked her to tell it again, and it's okay. I'll tell you once more, but I know their family quite well. But anyway. And I also should mention this, that this is only one instance within the corpus that it's used, which suggests that it's really, within the 6 hours of the corpus that have been transcribed. And so it's a kind of a rare phenomenon. It's not like you see signers doing this all the time. Then to establish whether Katakaloq signers do sometimes use spatial verb inflection, I've examined the following predicates within this same data set of 6 hours. And for these predicates, only 3 inflected forms. All right, I'll first read out the predicates. So there are talk, give, want, buy, marry, respect, and phone. So how did I select these? These are very common transitive predicates within the Katakaloq corpus. And these are the ones that you'd expect to be spatially inflected in other sign languages. So and there's only one verb that sort of is a potential candidate for spatial verb inflection, and that's the sign for talk. I'll show you first the normal form of talk, and then the special version of it, talk to me. And the first sign also means Katakaloq. Basically, it's their sign for signing or talking. And I first considered it might be a spatially inflected verb, but in fact this type of marking is not obligatory for the grammar. So you can get first-person reference and then still get the full form. And it's also non-productive, so you can't say I tell you or something. So in that sense, it's not really, it could be sort of specified separately in the lexicon without necessarily being a morphological process. So, and then having attested a possible candidate for transitive verbs in spontaneous discourse, I was a bit hesitant. So I have had to supplement my spontaneous data set with additional data, elicited with tools that aim to get the various transitive constructions within a sign language, to see if, maybe I could get more of them or they could be elicited. And what I used was sort of a picture identification task, where there's one signer describing a picture and the other one has to choose from 2 alternatives. But still, in these cases, Katakaloq signers weren't using transitive verbs. So even when, and it sort of resulted in ambiguous utterances, but I don't know, they, that's how they normally sign, really. And additionally, I've also adopted spatial, it's sort of the stimulus materials, the videos that were originally used to elicit reciprocal actions, so things like hugging each other or giving each other a hand or talking to each other. And interestingly, in these videos, I think because there were multiple participants, people started to use these list boys quite frequently. And I was very surprised to see that they're also using transitive predicates in conjugation with these list boys, and so they become spatially inflected on the fingertips of the hands. This sounds a bit complicated, but I've got a video. I do not have a transcript for this one, however, so I'm just going to have to show you or teach you a couple of katakalok signs. And there's only 3 signs you need to learn. So one of them is the sign for female, the second one for male, and the third one is the sign for speak. So I hope you all got that. The sign for female is the same like the R in finger spelling ASL. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to show it once now because I want to sort of wrap up a little bit. So to sum up, with regard to third-person reference in Katakalok, signers prefer deictic pointing signs to topographic locations. And anaphoric strategies are really rare in spontaneous discourse, and that includes the list boys and the transitive verb inflection. But then they can be used in more sort of abstract contexts where people are describing videos of people they don't know, and then you can elicit more anaphoric strategies within Katakalok, it appears. So it's previously been suggested that Katakalok's absolute geographic pointing system finds its origin in the Balinese absolute spatial reference system, which is very prominent in cultural areas such as religion, architecture, child rearing. But I think I don't have time to discuss this in detail, but I think that there's at least one sort of alternative hypothesis that we could formulate, which is that the density of the community's network may facilitate language use that is generally grounded within the village context, so in the topography, and it's dependent on the physical context of the utterance and communal knowledge of geography. So that's quite a mouthful, but basically what it means is that context dependency plays a really important role within everyday language use. And it doesn't mean that signers can't do other things when they need to describe different contexts. And I think it's in particular the fact that I've used spontaneous data compared with elicited data that brought this difference to light. So really it's all about how we sample our corpora and to address the specific answers or specific questions that we want to address. So the Katakalok data by themselves may not really fully distinguish between the 2 alternative hypotheses I've just brought up, but there's very similar reports from...
Sorry, what may not distinguish between the 2 hypotheses?
The Katakalok data that I've, the analysis of my data that I've shown may not be, distinguished between these 2 hypotheses. But if we look at other rural signing varieties, we find very similar patterns within the domain of person reference. So in Asiyat Bedouin Sign Language, Providence Island Sign Language, and Bangor Sign Language, there's also reported to feature like absolute pointing to indicate real-world locations in Bangor Sign Language of Thailand, by the way. There's also similar kinds of spatial constructions, including the absence of true toponyms, like place names. And also Asiyat Bedouin Sign Language and Providence Island Sign Language and Yucatec Mayan Sign Language use absolute pointing for person reference in a very similar way. This is all anecdotal evidence, so this is not based on corpus analysis. So we really need to sort of dig into this more to establish what are the real facts and how this compares to very context-dependent signing in urban signing communities, for instance. And so there's, at this point, there's also a number of alternative hypotheses that we could formulate. And one of them has been suggested by Wendy Sandler and her colleagues, which is the relatively limited time depth of some rural signing communities. And in the case of Katakalok, well, basically her argument is that, you know, that sign language might develop spatial verb inflection over time, and it's just, you know, we just have to wait for it to happen, as it did in Nicaraguan sign language. But actually, when we look at Katakalok, it's quite old. It goes back more than 100 years, so it's not necessarily very young. Also, not when we look at the various generations. But there's also methodological issues. So if we think about the generations of Katakalok signers, they're highly integrated on a social level. So people from different generations, they get married. People of different generations go to school together. So it's hard to distinguish exactly where we would sort of look for cohorts or development within the language. And that's something I'm still sort of thinking about. But with this in mind, I've really collected data from all different generations of Katakalok signers. And actually all the deaf people in the community are in there. And also, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there's a large percentage of second language learners within the community. So unlike other sign language corpora, the Katakalok corpus has also included hearing signers with varying degrees of proficiency. And so this is one aspect that I'm still haven't done any work on, but I'm interested to see how the mechanisms for person reference might be an effect of second language acquisition. I've got 1 minute and 2 slides, so I'll just try to be really short. And this is just a repetition of what I said. So the preference for absolute pointing in Katakalok discourse seems to be facilitated by a high degree of shared background knowledge, but also the establishment of anaphoric third-person pointing. In the case of Katakalok, these are the list boys, may be crucial for the development of spatial verb inflection and transitive verbs. So there's a historical component to this story. And you'd predict that a sign language that has spatial verb inflection also has loci. It has anaphoric pointing signs creating loci to refer back to these locations in signing space, but not necessarily vice versa. So you can have a sign language with loci, but no spatial verb inflection. This is my final slide, and it's a very general one. I believe that in the documentation and description of sign languages, village sign languages in particular, could really inform sign linguistics. And along the way, I've mentioned a couple of domains. So sign language typology, cross-modal contact between the spoken and the sign language, historical sign linguistics, sign language acquisition within a deaf community, deaf village community, and also sign bilingualism. But in any case, I think corpus analysis is a really crucial tool in establishing the true diversity among sign languages. And therefore, I think when we think about documenting sign language, it really should start with the creation of a corpus that's well sampled to include all the contexts within in which a sign language is being used.